On the 18th of July, 2024, 1-year-old nature photographer and seasoned outdoorsman David Reynolds set out on a solo expedition to document the remote wilderness of Colorado's Rocky Mountains. 4 weeks later, he never arrived at his planned exit point. On the 16th of August, a search and rescue operation discovered his abandoned base camp deep in the San Juan National Forest. Scattered among the site were a damaged gear bag, torn clothing, a professional camera system, and his meticulously kept field journal. Most troubling of all, David's remains were never found. What investigators uncovered in his photographs and notes would deeply challenge their understanding of Colorado's remote backcountry. David Reynolds, a Denver native, was a gifted wilderness photographer whose work had been published in Outside Magazine and Wildlife Photography International. With more than a decade of experience living in rugged terrain and advanced survival certifications, David was known for his careful planning and cautious approach to solo expeditions. He had successfully documented some of the most remote landscapes across the American West, from Montana's wild backcountry to Arizona's deserts. Colleagues described him as methodical, level-headed, and never reckless. His photography focused on capturing unusual animal behavior and pristine ecosystems, often spending months in isolation to secure the perfect shot. The goal of this particular expedition was a section of the San Juan National Forest known locally as Whispering Canyon, an untouched wilderness spanning roughly 12,000 acres in the heart of the Rockies. The area is defined by dense conifer forests, steep canyons, and sprawling cave systems, most of which remain unexplored due to unforgiving terrain and unpredictable weather. Historically, the region has been tied to strange events and unexplained sightings, including numerous reports of Bigfoot encounters dating back to the 1982. Local Native American communities regard parts of the canyon as sacred ground, avoiding certain areas they describe as the domain of the mountain's wandering guardians. On the 16th of August, 2024, forest officials were notified that David had failed to arrive at a scheduled rendezvous near Crystal Lake. Authorities launched an immediate search, focusing on the route he had outlined in his wilderness permit. The mission mobilized more than 50 personnel, including park rangers, county deputies, and volunteer rescue groups. Aircraft equipped with infrared detection systems scanned the forest canopy, while ground teams tracked every trail and stream identified in the area. After 8 days of intensive searching, operations were suspended as a dangerous weather front closed in. Torrential rain, thick fog, and treacherous terrain made the rescue effort extremely hazardous. Although David was experienced in survival and carried emergency gear, officials grew increasingly concerned for his safety. Whispering Canyon is notorious for disorienting even seasoned hikers, and the harsh environment created perfect conditions for disaster. The breakthrough came on the 24th of August, when a search dog led investigators to a campsite that appeared to have been hastily abandoned about 10 miles from David's last confirmed location. The scene was alarming. His shelter had been partially destroyed and dragged several feet from its original position. Camping gear was scattered across a wide area, and deep gouges carved into the surrounding trees suggested that a tremendous force had been present. The most significant discovery, however, was found inside David's damaged equipment bag, a high-end camera containing more than 250 images, along with a canvas-bound field journal documenting his entire expedition. David's plan had been to spend 4 weeks cataloging the ecological diversity of Whispering Canyon, with a particular focus on reports of an unknown primate population rumored to inhabit the region. His route would take him through some of the most isolated parts of the forest, along game trails that seemed almost prehistoric, and through stream valleys rarely touched by human presence. According to his notes, David had been drawn to this area by stories from local guides and backpackers who claimed to have encountered something unexplainable in the canyon's remote stretches. The early entries in his journal reflected his usual disciplined approach, combined with genuine enthusiasm for the expedition. The 18th of July. This is the perfect time to begin. The entrance was completely deserted. I haven't seen a soul since leaving the main trail 4 hours ago. The forest here feels ancient, with ponderosa pines clearly more than 400 years old. I captured some beautiful shots of a beaver family that seemed entirely at ease with my presence. This place feels untouched by modern society. The 20th of July. After 3 days, I've gone deeper into the wilderness than most people will ever venture. I came across what appears to be an ancient tribal trail marked by a line of stones, certainly not shown on any modern maps. The silence here is absolute, broken only by the occasional breeze through the branches and the distant calls of wildlife. Animal life is abundant: fresh moose tracks, countless deer prints, and what may be bear scat, though unusually large. My camera is performing well in the cool weather. The 22nd of July established my main camp beside a pristine mountain stream not marked on my survey map. This canyon feels like it exists in a biosphere of its own. Trees rise impossibly tall, undergrowth is dense beyond belief, and the sunlight filtering through the canopy has an almost otherworldly quality. I believe I may have photographed an unclassified lizard species living beneath the stream rocks. This expedition has already exceeded my scientific expectations. The 24th of July. Something remarkable occurred today. While photographing a golden eagle's nest in a massive ponderosa about 60 feet high, I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No birdsong, no insect noise, nothing. The stillness lasted nearly 15 minutes before gradually returning to normal. In my experience, such silence usually signals the presence of a large predator. This morning I discovered enormous tracks near camp. They are definitely not from bear, moose, or any species I recognize. Each print measures roughly 20 inches long and shows what appear to be 5 distinct toes. I'll attempt to cast them tomorrow if I can locate more. At this point, the steady, scientific tone of David's notes shifted dramatically. The 26th of July last night was unsettling. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of branches snapping together, like wood being knocked forcefully against wood. It wasn't the random creaking of shifting trees. The sound had rhythm intentional. Thud, 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 pause, thud, thud, pause, thud, 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 thud. It seemed to echo from multiple directions, as if several sources were communicating with each other. The moment I stepped out of the tent with my headlamp, everything went dead silent. This morning, I discovered more of the massive footprints closer to camp this time. They looked fresh, likely made during the night. The 28th of July, I've begun to feel as though I'm being watched. The sensation is constant, impossible to dismiss, even in the brightness of day. Yesterday, while photographing what I thought was a moose in a distant clearing, I realized the figure was far too tall and moving in an unnervingly upright stance. When I adjusted my zoom lens for clarity, it vanished into the forest. The photograph shows only a dark, upright silhouette, but the scale doesn't match any known animal in this region. My rational mind insists it's pareidolia, seeing shapes that aren't really there, but my instincts say otherwise. The 30th of July. Today I captured something remarkable, though I'm still analyzing what I witnessed. While following an animal trail deeper into the canyon, I heard sounds that resembled calls. They weren't human, yet not entirely animal either. The vocalizations were subtle, something like words coming from a dense thicket about 150 yards away. I managed to photograph a massive figure, partially concealed behind the trunks of ancient pines. The image is blurred by distance and foliage, but it clearly depicts a bipedal creature covered in reddish-brown hair, standing at least 8 to 9 feet tall. When it noticed me, it didn't bolt like a typical animal. Instead, it studied me for long, deliberate moments before turning and walking away with a controlled, almost human-like gait. The tone of my notes has shifted. The 1st of August. They're watching me. I use the plural because I've confirmed at least 4 distinct individuals, identified by varying footprint sizes and stride patterns. The largest must weigh well over 400 pounds, judging by the depth of its tracks in the wet ground. I've recorded hours of their calls, a strange mix of growls, wood knocks, clacking sounds, and something that can only be described as a primitive language. The intelligence in those vocalizations is both fascinating and terrifying. I'm torn between scientific curiosity and the gnawing awareness that I may be in real danger. The 3rd of August today marked my first direct encounter. While refilling water containers at the creek, I looked up to see one standing on the opposite bank, no more than 40 feet away. We regarded each other for what felt like an eternity. It was obvious it was assessing me, deciding whether or not I posed a threat. The intelligence in its eyes was undeniable. This was no mere animal, it was something far more advanced. I slowly reached for my camera, but it shook its head, a subtle, unmistakable gesture. When I lowered the camera, it gave a single nod and disappeared into the trees. In that moment, I began to understand. These beings are conscious and intelligent, far beyond anything I've encountered in the wild. The 5th of August. The situation has escalated. Last night, they came directly to my camp. I counted at least 5 distinct voices surrounding the shelter, engaged in what sounded like animated discussion. The vocalizations continued for nearly 2 hours, punctuated by the heavy footfalls of something massive circling the campsite. Through the narrow gap of my tent flap, I saw towering figures moving between the trees, their silhouettes illuminated by starlight. They seemed to be deliberating, perhaps deciding what to do about my presence. I have never felt more abandoned or alone. The final entries in David's journal reveal a man torn between his passion for discovery and an escalating fear for his survival. The 7th of August, I should leave, but I can't. What I've documented here could change our understanding of North American wildlife forever. These beings represent either an undiscovered primate species or something even more extraordinary. I've photographed their habitat modifications, complex shelters woven from branches, food storage sites, and what appear to be primitive tools. The implications are staggering, yet their attitude toward me has grown increasingly hostile. They've begun throwing rocks near my camp, displaying threatening behaviors, chest beating, snapping branches, and loud growls. I think they want me gone from their territory. The 9th of August. The situation is critical. Last night, they stole some of my gear supplies and one of my water filtration units. It feels like psychological pressure, forcing me out without direct confrontation. I'm rationing what remains and preparing to hike toward the pickup point within a day or two. But I've made an astonishing discovery. Deep inside a cave system less than 10 feet from my camp, I found rock art. The paintings clearly depict humanoid figures alongside animals native to modern Colorado. Some images look ancient, while others seem surprisingly recent. This suggests these beings may have inhabited the canyon for centuries, perhaps millennia. The final journal entry is markedly different from the rest, written in uneven, hurried strokes, possibly from fear or exhaustion. Whatever David was experiencing, it had clearly taken a toll. The 10th of August, my last entry. I've decided to take one final photograph, then begin the hike out in the morning. The largest male, the one I've come to call the chief, has followed me all day. He is enormous, easily 9 feet tall, built like a linebacker. His face carries a disturbingly human quality, though with pronounced brow ridges and a cranial crest suggesting tremendous jaw strength. I noticed he wore what appeared to be a necklace of animal teeth and polished stones, clear evidence of symbolic thought and cultural behavior. If I can capture a clear image of him, it will serve as undeniable proof of their existence. The risk is immense, but the scientific value is immeasurable. When investigators later examined David's camera, they discovered more than 250 photographs documenting his 4-week expedition. The early images showed typical wilderness, subjects, landscapes, wildlife, plant life. But the later photographs revealed increasingly compelling evidence of large, unidentified creatures living within Whispering Canyon. Wildlife biologists and cryptozoologists who reviewed David's material have since put forward several theories regarding his fate. Theory 1. Forced territorial displacement. The creatures may have driven David from their territory without physically harming him. Some researchers suggest he could have been transported to a remote location, left to find his own way, only to become lost in the process. Theory 2. Protective captivity. A more controversial possibility is that the creatures deliberately took David to prevent him from exposing their existence to the outside world. Such a scenario would imply a sophisticated awareness of human society and media, an understanding that would radically alter our perception of their intelligence. Theory 3. Accidental death. Another hypothesis holds that David may have succumbed to environmental hazards, injury, exposure, or misadventure in the midst of his encounters. Although no physical remains were ever recovered, some investigators believe David may have died of natural causes or an accident while attempting to document the creatures, and that his body was either concealed or carried away by them. Theory 4. Voluntary disappearance. The strangest hypothesis suggests that David may have chosen to stay with the beings, perhaps seeking acceptance into their community. His final journal entries reveal not only fear, but also an almost reverent fascination. His scientific background could have made him valuable in documenting their culture from within. Professional trackers who examined the abandoned campsite noted several anomalies. The footprints taken from the area measured between 20 and 24 inches, showing toe patterns unlike any known North American animal. The disturbance of the site suggested an intelligent, purposeful search rather than the random foraging of wildlife. Broken branches and damaged trees indicated strength far beyond that of any recognized species in the region. The disappearance of David Reynolds and the evidence he left behind reignited the scientific debate over the possible existence of undiscovered primates in North America. In the aftermath, Whispering Canyon was designated a protected research area, restricted to authorized scientific personnel. Several universities launched joint projects to investigate the region using non-invasive techniques in search of further evidence. The quality and consistency of David's photographs, combined with his reputation as a skilled, honest photographer, convinced many experts that his material represented authentic encounters with unknown beings. A primatologist at Colorado State University stated, David's photos demonstrate behavioral complexity and physical traits that would be extremely difficult to fake. The consistency across multiple images, paired with his detailed field notes, provides the most compelling evidence I've seen for unknown hominids in North America. Despite extensive searches, David Reynolds has never been found. Whispering Canyon continues to draw researchers, explorers, and those seeking to unravel the mystery of his disappearance. His camera and journal remain the most significant pieces of evidence in modern cryptozoological research, offering profound insight into a world that may exist just beyond the edge of human understanding. In his final journal entry, David wrote, "If anything happens to me, know that I died pursuing the greatest discovery of our time. These beings are real, they are intelligent, and they have shared this continent with us far longer than we ever imagined. The forest holds secrets that could change everything we think we know about evolution, intelligence, and humanity's place in the natural world." The mystery of David Reynolds and the beings of Whispering Canyon remains unsolved. Yet his legacy continues to inspire new generations of researchers to explore the hidden corners of the world, searching for answers to questions we are only just beginning to ask. A year after his disappearance, a backpacker stumbled upon a small cairn of stones near the original search zone. Beneath it was a water canister, later identified as David Reynolds' own. And then, 10 years later, the story took an even darker turn. For anyone listening, for anyone thinking of following in his footsteps, don't. Some mysteries are meant to remain untouched. 10 years. That's how long I've kept this secret buried. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. But nightmares don't lie. And the scar on my left shoulder, where claws raked through flesh, is a constant reminder that what happened to me in the Appalachian Mountains was terrifyingly real. My name is Kelly Denver, and I'm finally ready to tell my story. It was the 15th of October, 2014, and I had been planning this solo hike for months. Autumn in the Appalachians was at its peak, and I had chosen a moderately difficult trail deep in the remote Blue Ridge Mountains, about 60 miles southwest of Asheville, North Carolina. The forecast called for clear skies and cool temperatures hovering around 60 Fahrenheit, perfect conditions for a long hike, but I wasn't completely alone. My loyal companion, Scout, a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix I had rescued from a shelter in Charlotte, trotted eagerly beside me with the kind of boundless enthusiasm only a dog can bring to a mountain adventure. Scout had joined me on dozens of hikes, and his protective instincts had saved us from trouble with aggressive wildlife more than once. He wasn't just a hiking partner, he was my security system and my best friend, all rolled into one. We set out around 6:30 a.m. from a little-used trailhead that only saw a handful of hikers even on crowded weekends. This wasn't one of the Instagram-famous trails with wooden signage and well-maintained switchbacks. This was true wilderness, the kind of place where your cell signal vanishes within the first mile, and you can walk for hours without seeing another human being. The path wound through dense hardwood forests of towering oaks and maples. Their canopy was so thick that even at midday, the forest floor stayed dim and cool. Old-growth rhododendrons lined the trail, their tangled branches forming natural tunnels overhead. The twisted limbs arched into vault-like shapes, giving the eerie impression of walking through a forgotten cathedral. For the first 6 hours, everything was perfect. Scout and I kept a steady pace, pausing occasionally so I could snap photos of especially striking views or curious rock formations. The autumn air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and the distant sound of a stream running over stone. By late afternoon, around 4 p.m., we reached what I thought was the midpoint of the planned loop. I pulled out my map and GPS, checking our position while Scout sniffed curiously around a fallen log. According to my calculations, we were about an hour from the overlook I had aimed for, where we'd begin descending back toward the trailhead. But as I studied the map more carefully, my stomach dropped. I'd made a navigation mistake earlier in the day. We had taken a wrong fork in the trail nearly 2 miles back, one that had carried us deeper into the wilderness than I intended. Instead of being halfway through the loop, we were now committed to a much longer route across unfamiliar terrain. Scout, of course, didn't mind. His tail wagged furiously as he sniffed out every new scent on the wind. I decided to push forward rather than backtrack. After all, I was an experienced hiker, well-equipped, with plenty of water and emergency gear. What could go wrong? The answer revealed itself 3 hours later, when a flawless autumn day turned into my worst nightmare. We had been climbing steadily along a ridgeline, the forest occasionally parting to reveal sweeping valleys below. The trail grew faint, more like a game path, marked only by the occasional scuff on tree bark. I was already thinking about turning back when Scout froze. His ears shot forward, his body stiffened, every nerve in him focused. I had learned long ago to trust Scout's instincts without question. If he was on alert, something was wrong. I stood completely still, scanning the forest for movement. The afternoon silence was absolute, no bird song, no rustling in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. That's when I saw it. Roughly 50 yards ahead, barely visible in the dappled shadows, a massive, tawny figure slipped smoothly between the trees. A mountain lion. My blood went cold. In all my years of hiking, I had never come face to face with one of the apex predators of these mountains, though I knew they lived here. This one was huge, 6 feet from nose to rump, not counting the tail. Its shoulders and haunches rippled with explosive power. It moved with the casual confidence of a creature that had never met anything it couldn't kill. And Scout had seen it too. The hair on Scout's back stood on end, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. I grabbed his collar, forcing myself to stay calm, as every survival tip I'd ever read about mountain lion encounters flashed through my mind. Don't run, make yourself look big, back away slowly. Never turn your back. But this cat wasn't behaving by the book. Instead of avoiding contact, it deliberately advanced toward us. Its golden eyes locked on mine with a predatory intensity that made my skin crawl. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was a hunter who had made its decision. I began inching backward, keeping Scout behind me. The lion shadowed each step, circling to cut off our retreat. It was stalking us, and doing it with an intelligence that terrified me. Easy, buddy, I whispered to Scout, whose body trembled with the effort of holding back his protective instincts. Easy now. But Scout knew what I was refusing to admit. We were in serious trouble. The attack came like lightning. One moment the lion was 45 yards away, the next it was airborne, covering the distance in 3 thunderous bounds. I barely had time to choke out a strangled cry before 150 pounds of muscle and claws slammed into my chest, driving me hard into a tree. That was when Scout made his choice. Even as I hit the ground, even as claws tore into my left shoulder and the hot breath of the predator filled my nostrils, Scout hurled himself at the lion. The impact of his 70 pounds of fury struck its flank, knocking it off me and sending both animals crashing into the undergrowth. What followed was the most horrifying sound I have ever heard. Growls, snarls, the wet crunch of teeth on flesh. I staggered to my feet, my shoulder burning, blood soaking my shirt, frantically searching for anything stick, rock, anything that could serve as a weapon. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt eternal. Scout was brave, fearless, but he was no match for a mountain lion. I knew it, and I think on some level, so did he. But he gave me those seconds. Every single one. "Scout!" I screamed, frantic, tearing through the forest floor for something to even the odds. And then suddenly it was over. The mountain lion emerged from the brush, muzzle slick with blood, dragging Scout's limp body. My beautiful, loyal companion was gone, his neck broken in a single devastating bite. The cat looked at me once more, as if weighing whether I was worth the effort. Then, without a sound, it hauled Scout's body into the darkening forest and vanished, leaving me alone with my grief and horror. The hours that followed are a blur. I remember sobbing until no tears would come. I remember calling Scout's name until my voice was gone, even though I'd seen his lifeless body dragged away. I remember trying to retrace my steps along the trail, but shock and grief scrambled my mind. The bleeding from my shoulder had mostly stopped, but the wound was deep and needed real medical care. Somewhere in my panic, I'd lost the trail entirely. Now I stood in dense forest, surrounded by nothing but tangled undergrowth, with no clear way out. The sun was sinking fast, the air already turning cold. I had a small first aid kit in my pack, a space blanket, and a few energy bars. But I hadn't planned for an overnight stay, certainly not under these circumstances. My plan had been simple: get back to the car by 6 p.m., drive home to Charlotte, take a hot shower, and eat a warm meal. Instead, I was staggering blindly through the forest, trying to find my way back to the trail while reeling from the loss of my best friend who had given his life to save mine. Every shadow looked like a mountain lion. Every sound made me flinch. I was running on adrenaline and raw survival instinct. As darkness fell, I realized I had no choice but to stop and find shelter. Hiking at night, especially in my state of mind, was a recipe for disaster. I could slip off a ridge, tumble into a ravine, or lose myself even further. I found a small clearing beside a rock outcropping that offered some protection from the wind. Using my emergency supplies, I set up a crude shelter and braced myself for what would become the longest night of my life. The first noises came around 10 p.m. I was curled inside my space blanket, shivering against grief and cold, when I heard movement in the woods. This wasn't the light rustle of foraging raccoons or deer. It was heavy, deliberate. At first, I thought the lion had returned, maybe finished with Scout, and now decided I was worth the chase. I gripped the thickest branch I could find and pressed my back against the rock wall. But as the footsteps grew closer, I realized this was no cat. The movements were too weighty, too careful, and there was more than one. I could hear multiple shapes in the darkness, circling me. Then came the sound that froze my blood. A voice, low, guttural, something like speech, not quite human, not quite animal, something in between, filled with intelligence and intent. The noises drew closer, and through the gaps in the trees, I began to make out massive figures moving in the moonlight. They were enormous, larger than any man walking upright, but hunched, ape-like. In the shifting shadows, I could barely comprehend their forms. For years, I had dismissed such things as folklore, hoaxes, blurry videos online. Yet here they were, surrounding me with the practiced coordination of predators who had done this before. One moment I was alone in my makeshift lean-to. The next, I was encircled by 4 towering shapes blotting out the starlight. Up close, they were more terrifying than I had ever imagined. 7 to 8 feet tall, draped in coarse black hair that seemed to swallow what little moonlight pierced the canopy. Their faces were a nightmarish mix of ape and man. Heavy brows, deep-set eyes, jaws built for raw power. But it was the eyes that undid me, eyes that burned with unmistakable intelligence, eyes that knew. I screamed and tried to bolt, but there was no escape. To my left, one stepped into my path, its massive frame blocking me completely. To my right, another stared at me with those impossibly aware eyes. The largest of them, the one I would later come to think of as the leader, let out a sound-like language, as if communicating with the others. Before I could react, massive hands closed around me and lifted me off the ground as easily as if I were a child. I kicked, clawed, screamed, did everything in my power to fight back. It didn't matter. Their strength was beyond anything I had ever known. To them, my thrashing was no more troublesome than holding a struggling house cat. As they carried me deeper into the forest, slung over a broad shoulder, another sound reached my ears, something that made me stop fighting and start listening. Wolves, howling in the distance, not one or two, an entire pack, moving closer. And then I heard something else. A low, hacking roar I recognized from nature documentaries. A black bear, and it sounded very, very close. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. These beings weren't abducting me. They were rescuing me. What I had thought of as a dark, hostile forest was alive with predators, and I was prey barely clinging to survival after the mountain lion. The big cat that killed Scout may have only been the beginning of my troubles. As if to confirm my realization, one of the creatures made a sound, something low, guttural, yet almost like words. A series of chest-deep rumbles that, to my ears, carried comfort rather than menace. The message was unmistakable. We will not harm you. We are taking you somewhere safe. The journey through the woods seemed endless. My captors or rescuers, I no longer knew which, moved with astonishing stealth for creatures of their size. They threaded through the wilderness as if guided by invisible maps, navigating terrain a human would never manage in darkness. We climbed steadily upward, sometimes along paths that felt worn by centuries of passage, other times scrambling over jagged rock, where I could feel their massive frames shift and cooperate to carry me securely. Their sense of coordination was uncanny, as if each movement had been rehearsed countless times. In the distance, I could hear water. Not the trickling stream I'd heard earlier in the day, but something far larger, maybe a river, maybe a waterfall. After what felt like hours but must have been 45 minutes, we broke free of the dense forest into open moonlight. We stood on a rocky slope high on the mountainside. Above us, a cliff face loomed, sharp against the stars. That was their destination. At first, I saw nothing but bare stone. Solid, unbroken, no cleft wide enough for something of their size. But as we approached, shadows shifted. What I thought was a fold of darkness resolved into an opening, a vast fissure in the mountain itself, concealed by a natural overhang and thick with vines and branches. From even a short distance, it would have looked like nothing more than rock and shadow. They had chosen well. You could walk past this place 100 times and never know an entire cave system lay hidden here. Crossing the threshold, the air grew instantly cooler, carrying the mineral tang of subterranean space. But this was no ordinary cave. It was enormous. The entryway stretched on and on, branching into darkened passageways. The ceiling was so high, it disappeared into blackness. The silence carried a cathedral weight, a sense of age and immensity. The creatures moved as confidently underground as they had in the forest, as though they had lived here for generations. They navigated with unerring certainty, by touch, by sound, by some instinct of orientation beyond my comprehension. I would have been hopelessly lost within minutes, and then, deeper in, something caught my eye. When one of them produced a crude torch, just a length of wood wrapped with resinous fibers and burning low, I saw that the cavern walls were covered with markings. Not cracks, not mineral veins, but deliberate inscriptions. Symbols. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not alphabetic like English, not pictographic like Egyptian hieroglyphs. They were geometric, spirals, interlocking lines, and angular patterns, all following an internal logic I couldn't decipher. Some were ancient, worn down by moisture and centuries of time. Others looked recent, sharp-edged, freshly etched. It was a language, or perhaps a record. And at that moment, one chilling thought burned into me. I was not the first human to stand here. This wasn't just a cave where these beings sheltered. This was their home, and it had been for a very, very long time. Eventually, we entered what felt like a central chamber, far larger than any of the passageways we had traveled. The one carrying me lowered me gently to the ground, and I found myself standing inside a space that bore little resemblance to the wild cavern I had expected. The chamber was vast, cathedral-like, with a ceiling lost in darkness far above. The floor was remarkably flat, layered with something like fine gravel or sand. Along the walls, more of those cryptic markings covered the stone, and in places, the rock looked shaped, deliberately carved. But what struck me most wasn't the symbols. It was the life in this place. This was no lair. It was a dwelling. There were clear sections serving different purposes. Bedding areas lined with thick furs, fire pits glowing with coals, and alcoves that seemed designated for food preparation. A sense of order, of permanence, radiated through the chamber. One of the beings smaller than the leader approached me holding something. In the flicker of the torch, I saw it was food. A bundle of berries, some kind of nut, and strips of raw meat. The meat was fresh, slick with blood from some unknown animal. The creature placed it in front of me and stepped back, its deep-set eyes watching with unnerving intelligence. The message was unmistakable. Eat. I hadn't eaten since my energy bar that morning. Hunger gnawed at me, but the sight of raw meat turned my stomach. The berries seemed the safest option, though I couldn't identify them. And yet I was afraid to refuse. These creatures had saved me, but for what reason? Out of kindness, or because they had some use for me I couldn't yet imagine? I had heard tales of Bigfoot encounters that spanned from benign to terrifying. Which kind was mine? So I ate. The berries were tart and faintly sweet, not unpleasant. The nuts were hard to chew, but earthy and rich. As for the meat, I tried not to think about it. It was tough, gamey, feral. But I forced it down, needing protein, and needing to show them I accepted their gift. They watched intently as I chewed. When I swallowed, a ripple of satisfaction seemed to pass among them. The leader rumbled a deep, guttural tone that the others echoed. It sounded like conversation about me, about what to do with me. When I finished, the leader gestured toward a corner where furs had been piled into a rough bed. The message was clear: rest. I was exhausted, physically wrecked, mentally drained. The adrenaline that had carried me through the past 24 hours was finally gone. I curled up in the furs, warm and surprisingly soft, trying to process everything. My shoulder burned from the lion's claws, and my chest ached with the fresh grief of losing Scout. But I was alive. These beings, whatever they were, had saved my life. As I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, I heard them moving about the chamber, settling into their own rest. I never fully relaxed. Every sound, every shuffle in the darkness jolted me back toward wakefulness. Safe, yes, but also a prisoner in a place no human was ever meant to see. At some point, I must have dozed, because when I stirred again, the chamber was utterly dark save for the faint glow of embers in a stone fire pit. The air was heavy with the sound of deep, slow breathing, the slumber of massive creatures. And then it hit me. This was my chance. For the first time since entering the cave, I had the chance to move unseen, to learn, to understand where I was and perhaps what they intended for me. I moved as quietly as I could, slipping from the crude bed of furs and letting the fading firelight guide me. The cave system was even more immense than I had imagined. From the central chamber, at least 6 separate passageways branched off, each vanishing into darkness. Some tunnels were broad, easily accommodating the creature's size. Others were narrower, just wide enough for someone human to pass through. Everywhere I looked, the walls were covered in markings, some carved deep into the rock, others painted with what looked like natural pigments. The oldest were weathered and faint, worn down by centuries of moisture. But others were recent, sharp-edged and clear, undeniable signs that this place was still in use. Someone or something had been inscribing this history for an unimaginably long time. But what I discovered down a side passage nearly stole the breath from my lungs. The corridor opened into what could only be described as a gallery. The walls weren't just covered in abstract symbols, but in vivid depictions. Animals I recognized, deer, bears, mountain lions, wolves, were drawn with surprising accuracy. And then there were the others, the creatures themselves, portrayed in various activities. Some hunted in coordinated groups, others gathered in social circles. There were images of what looked like families, taller figures and smaller ones that could only be children. And then came the most staggering discovery. Human figures. Not many, but enough to be unmistakable. Some appeared to be fleeing from the beings. Others seemed to be engaging peacefully with them. One image in particular froze me where I stood, a human figure and one of the creatures, together, straining shoulder to shoulder to move an enormous stone. The implications were earth-shattering. This wasn't just a cave where an undiscovered species lived. This was a record, a chronicle of existence, of culture, of history. These beings had occupied these mountains for countless generations, long enough to build traditions, a society, and a living memory of contact with humanity. Studying the images, I began to understand something I had resisted until now. They weren't primitive animals. They were intelligent, perhaps as intelligent as us, but living a completely different way. They had chosen to remain hidden, to avoid the world we had built. But here, beneath the mountains, they had their own world. A culture, a history, a society. The final passage I explored brought me to another chamber, smaller than the main hall, but still large enough to dwarf me. And there, what I saw left me paralyzed with awe. 4 massive figures slept together in a corner, their bodies curled close for warmth. 2 were enormous adults, easily 8 feet tall, even lying down. The other 2 were smaller, still larger than any human, but younger, their limbs less developed, their faces softer. A family, parents and children. In sleep, they looked far less fearsome. Their faces relaxed, they seemed almost human. I could see the familial resemblance in their features, the way they pressed close to one another, the small adjustments to share warmth and comfort. It was profoundly human behavior, and in that moment, the word monster evaporated from my mind. They were people, not human people, but people nonetheless. They had families, they had emotions, they had lives. The one who had carried me here hadn't abducted me. He had saved me, carried me to safety, just as any man might carry a stranger in need. But as I watched them sleep, another realization struck me. Dawn was coming. The first threads of light seeped into the cave entrance, dim but visible. This was my chance. My only chance. I didn't know what their long-term intentions were, and I wasn't ready to find out. I needed to return to civilization. I needed medical care for my shoulder. I needed to grieve Scout properly, to process what I had endured. And I needed to decide whether the world was ready for the truth of what I had discovered. I moved as quietly as I could, slipping back into the main chamber. The beings who had brought me here were still asleep, their massive bodies rising and falling with deep, slow breaths. I could see the faint outline of the passage that led toward the cave mouth. If I was careful, if I was silent, I could be out before they woke. Escaping the cave proved harder than I expected. The tunnels that had seemed straightforward when I was carried in now twisted like a labyrinth. I took wrong turns, stumbled into chambers I hadn't seen before, doubled back, tried again. At last, after what felt like hours, I saw it. The pale glow of morning filtering through stone. The sight of daylight nearly broke me. Freedom was only a few hundred yards away. As I crept toward the exit, I heard it. The beings stirring behind me. Low voices, guttural but deliberate, rising and overlapping in the dark. I didn't need to understand the words. They knew I was gone. They were deciding what to do. I reached the mouth of the cave just as the sun crested the ridge. The forest, bathed in daylight, looked entirely different, less menacing, more familiar. Below me stretched the slope we had climbed the night before, and beyond that, the forest where I had been lost. Only now, I wasn't lost. From this high vantage point, I spotted markers, natural ridges, and clearings that told me where I was. Far in the distance, I saw a trail, not the primitive game path Scout and I had taken, but a maintained trail that hugged the mountainside. Civilization was there. I didn't dare look back. If I turned, I might see them following, and I wasn't ready for another encounter. The descent was brutal. The slope was steep, littered with loose stone, and my shoulder screamed with every slip. But adrenaline and the promise of safety kept me moving. I stumbled, slid, fell more than once, but I pushed on, desperate to put distance between myself and that cave. It took me 6 hours to reach the trail I had glimpsed from above. By then, I was dehydrated, exhausted, and in blinding pain. But I was also elated. I had returned to mark trails to a world I understood. The path was wide, clearly marked, and well-maintained. Nothing like the wilderness trail where Scout had died. I followed it downhill, knowing it would eventually lead to a trailhead, a parking lot, some sign of civilization. 2 hours later, I saw them. 3 hikers, middle-aged, well-equipped, clearly experienced, were making their way up the trail. When they saw me filthy, bloodied, staggering, they froze, then rushed toward me without hesitation. "Are you all right?" one of them asked, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes. I almost collapsed then and there. These were the first humans I had seen since the nightmare began, and they represented everything I had feared I might never experience again. Human kindness, human reason, human civilization. "I need help," I croaked. "I was attacked by a mountain lion. My dog is gone." They didn't hesitate. One man pulled a first aid kit and began tending my shoulder immediately. Another activated a satellite phone, calling for emergency evacuation. The woman who had spoken first stayed beside me, grounding me with her presence, letting me speak. I told them about the attack, about Scout's sacrifice, about getting lost, but I didn't tell them the rest. How could I? How could I explain that I had spent the night in a cave with a family of giants, that I had seen symbols carved into stone, eyes full of intelligence, a society hidden beneath the mountains? They would never believe me. They would think shock had broken me, that hallucinations born of blood loss and trauma had warped my memory. They would be kind about it, but they would not believe. So I stayed silent, and maybe that was for the best. Maybe some secrets were meant to remain hidden. The rescue team reached us 3 hours later on the trail. They evacuated me to a hospital in Asheville, where doctors cleaned and stitched the gashes in my shoulder and treated me for dehydration and exposure. The wounds were deep but clean, and they assured me I would heal without permanent damage. The hardest part came afterward, calling my family, telling them what had happened. My parents were devastated over Scout. They had loved him nearly as much as I did. My sister broke down in tears when I told her how he had thrown himself at a mountain lion to save me. They all wanted to know how I had survived a night alone in the wilderness, so I gave them a carefully edited version of the truth. I told them I had found a cave for shelter, that I'd had a few supplies in my pack. That luck and stubbornness had carried me through until morning. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. I had found shelter. I had been given food, and luck had played a part. I just left out the detail of who or what had provided those things. Authorities were sympathetic but thorough. They wanted precise details about where the lion attack had happened, whether I thought the animal was still in the area, whether trails needed to be closed. I gave them the best description I could of the place where Scout had fallen, but I was vague about the cave's exact location. A search party was sent to recover Scout's remains, but they never found him. The lion must have dragged him too far into the vast wilderness. Later, at home, I held a small memorial for him in my backyard, just family and a few close friends. I told stories about our hikes, our adventures, how he had been my loyal, brave companion. But I never told them about his final act of heroism, not the full truth. It was too painful, too private, and bound up in secrets I wasn't ready to share. The years passed. I returned to hiking, though never alone, and never again in those mountains. I devoured everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings, cryptozoology, and folklore. Most accounts were obvious hoaxes or mistakes, but some carried details I knew too well. Consistent patterns. Witnesses describing intelligence, avoidance of humans, even protective behavior toward those they deemed harmless. Accounts that matched my own experience. More than once, I thought about speaking up, about telling my story to researchers or investigators. But every time, I remembered the family I had seen asleep together in that hidden chamber. I remembered the way they had saved me, protected me, fed me, and I asked myself, do I have the right to expose them? The symbols carved into the cave walls weren't the markings of animals. They were records of a culture that had endured for centuries, perhaps millennia. These beings had been in the mountains longer than any written human history. They had built their own society, lived by their own rules, shaped their own relationship with the natural world. If the world discovered them, what would happen? Would they be studied, protected, respected, or hunted, captured, exploited? Would tourists flood their territory? Would governments seek to control them? I thought of the intelligence in their eyes, the communication in their voices, the gentleness when they offered me food. They weren't animals, they were people. Different from us, but people nonetheless. They deserved privacy, self-determination, the same things we demand for ourselves. So why am I breaking the silence now, after 10 years of carrying it alone? Because the weight has become too much. This experience changed me in ways I am still discovering. I look at the natural world differently now, with greater reverence for its mysteries and deeper respect for the unknown. I've become wary of human arrogance, of our assumption that we already understand everything about the world around us. But mostly, I believe this story needs to be told even if no one believes me. There are things in this world we do not understand, beings that exist beyond our current knowledge, mountains that still hold secrets, some of them too important to ignore. I'm not asking you to believe me. I offer no proof, no demand for scientific investigation. I am simply sharing what happened to me, what I saw, what I experienced, what I learned. You can take from it whatever you will. Those beings saved my life. When I was at my weakest, they chose compassion over indifference. They could have let me die in the forest. They could have let the wolves or the bear find me. They could have ignored me entirely. Instead, they chose to help, to protect, to provide for someone not even of their own kind. That alone is a lesson worth remembering, no matter what you think of the source. I still think of Scout every day. His death was the price of my survival, and I carry that weight with me always. But I also carry the memory of his courage, his loyalty, his willingness to sacrifice everything for the one he loved. In that moment, when the mountain lion struck, he didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do, and he did it. The beings in the cave showed me another kind of courage, the courage to help a stranger, to share resources with someone who could never repay them, to act with compassion even when it meant revealing themselves to an outsider. They risked everything to save me, and I tried to honor that risk by keeping their secret. But secrets grow heavy, and after 10 years, this one demanded to be spoken. I don't know if I will ever return to those mountains. Part of me longs to find the cave again, to thank them properly. Another part hopes I never do, that they remain safe, hidden, untouched in their ancient home. Either way, I will never forget what I learned in those caverns. The world holds more than we imagine. It is more intelligent than we assume, more compassionate than we expect. Sometimes the monsters in the dark are the ones who save us. And sometimes the most terrifying experiences can also be the most profound. I don't know what those beings are. Not really. I don't know where they came from, or how long they've walked those mountains. I don't know if there are others like them elsewhere in the world. But I know they are real. I know they are intelligent. And I know they chose to help me when they could have chosen otherwise. And I know this. Somewhere out there in the Appalachian Mountains, inside a hidden cavern etched with ancient symbols and steeped in the evidence of a culture lost to time, there are beings who understand something about compassion that all of us could stand to learn. That is the story I have carried for 10 years. That is the secret I finally chose to share. Believe me or don't, that choice is yours. But the next time you are alone in the wilderness, the next time you hear strange sounds in the night, the next time you feel unseen eyes watching you, remember, you may not be as alone as you think, and that might not be such a bad thing.